My hands froze when I saw my name printed on the wedding invitation, but it wasn't Daniel's upcoming marriage that made my stomach twist. It was the final line at the bottom, written in delicate gold lettering as if it were some afterthought, something small and insignificant, when in reality, it was anything but. Join us as we celebrate love, family, and the long-awaited return of someone we've missed dearly. My pulse pounded in my ears as my eyes darted back to those words, reading them again and again, hoping I had somehow misunderstood. A return? What return? I hadn't spoken to my family in 7 years, and that wasn't by accident. No one had reached out to mend what they had broken. No one had even tried. And now, out of nowhere, my estrangement had apparently ended because they had decided it for me? The arrogance of it made my skin prickle with heat. They weren't just inviting me to Daniel's wedding. They were announcing my grand reconciliation like it was already set in stone. I gritted my teeth and ran my thumb over the embossed letters, as if touching them would make them disappear. This wasn't just some innocent mistake. It was a power move, a way of controlling the narrative, a way of rewriting the past to make it seem like I had always been welcome, like the last 7 years of silence had never happened. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled until I found Daniel's number, my thumb hesitating for only a second before I hit call. The line barely rang twice before he picked up, and the second I heard the amused lilt in his voice, I wanted to reach through the phone and wipe it off his face. Well, Daniel said smoothly, like this was all a game to him. I was wondering when you'd call. My grip tightened around the invitation, the paper crinkling under my fingers as anger coiled hot in my chest. What the hell is this? I demanded, my voice sharp, cutting, but Daniel just let out a low chuckle, the same patronizing one he used to give me whenever he thought I was overreacting. An invitation, he said lightly, as if that wasn't obvious, as if I wasn't seconds away from tearing the damn thing apart. It's customary to send them when you're getting married. Cut the crap, I snapped. Why does it say you're welcoming me back? I never agreed to anything. You don't get to decide that for me. There was a pause, a brief flicker of hesitation in his silence, but it was gone too fast for me to catch hold of it. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its humor, but there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite place. It's not just about the wedding, he said carefully. It's about Dad. The shift in my chest was immediate, like someone had dropped a stone into my stomach, heavy and cold and unforgiving. I hadn't heard about our father in years, hadn't spoken his name, hadn't allowed myself to think about him beyond the rare, fleeting moments when the memories forced their way to the surface. The last time we stood in the same room, he had looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer his son, that he had nothing more to say to me. And I had believed him. I had packed my things, walked out that door, and never looked back. And now, suddenly, I was supposed to care? What about him? I asked, my voice stiff, controlled, but I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Daniel sighed, and for the first time, he didn't sound amused or smug. He just sounded tired. He's dying. The words settled over me like thick smoke, suffocating and disorienting, but I refused to let them touch me, refused to let them sink beneath my skin. I waited for the gut punch of grief, for the sadness, for the regret, for something, but there was only the dull, empty silence stretching between me and my brother. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my voice steady, to act as if this didn't change anything. And Daniel's sigh was heavier this time, like he had expected a different reaction, like he had assumed that telling me Dad was dying would be enough to make me drop everything and run back home. And he wants to see you, he said, and even though I had been expecting it, even though I had already known those words were coming, they still made something in my chest twist painfully. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. Of course he does. Now that he's dying, suddenly I exist again. My fingers curled tighter around the invitation, my nails digging into the thick cardstock. You really think I'm just going to come running back because he finally decided I'm worth his time? He regrets it, Daniel said, and I could tell he was choosing his words carefully, trying to find the right ones to break through the wall I had built. But he was wasting his time. Oh, does he? I shot back, my voice dripping with venom. That's funny, because I don't remember hearing a single goddamn word from him these past 7 years. Not a call, not a text, not a fucking postcard. But now, all of a sudden, When he's at the end of the road, when he doesn't have any other choice, he wants to see me? That's not regret, Daniel. That's desperation. For the first time, my brother didn't have a quick response. The silence stretched longer this time, and even though I couldn't see him, I could feel his frustration, the way he was trying to hold himself back from snapping at me. Finally, he exhaled slowly. I'm not asking you to forgive him, he said, his voice quieter now, lower, like he was trying to reach me on some emotional level that no longer existed. I'm just telling you the truth. He doesn't have much time. And like it or not, you're still his son. My jaw clenched as something sharp and ugly flared in my chest. Not by his choice, I said flatly. He made that pretty damn clear when he told me to leave. Daniel didn't argue. He just sighed again, and this time, there was something final in it, something resigned. Look, he said, his voice softer now. I know you have every reason to hate him. I know he hurt you. But this might be your only chance to get closure. Closure? What a laughable concept. There was no closure to be found in a man who had cast me aside like I was nothing. No redemption in a last-minute plea for absolution. No undoing the years of silence with one single act of remorse. But despite everything, despite every ounce of anger and resentment boiling inside me, there was something about the way Daniel had phrased things, the way he had hesitated just a second too long before speaking, the way they had assumed I would come back without even asking, that didn't sit right with me. It was too calculated, too carefully planned, too off. And whether I liked it or not, I needed to know why. I should have hung up. I should have told Daniel that whatever game he and Dad were playing wasn't going to work on me. I should have reminded him that Dad had been just fine pretending I didn't exist for the past 7 years, and I had been just fine returning the favor. But instead, I just stood there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles ached, listening to the silence on the other end of the line stretch longer and longer, waiting for Daniel to say something else, waiting for him to give me a reason to care. But he didn't. He just waited, like he knew this would be enough, like he was counting on my curiosity, my anger, my something to keep me from walking away from this. And the worst part was, it worked. Because no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I did want to know why Dad had changed his mind. I did want to know what exactly had made him decide that I was worth speaking to again, worth acknowledging, worth inviting back into a family that had already erased me. And if I wanted to know, there was only one way to find out. I let out a slow breath, ignoring the way my pulse pounded in my ears, ignoring the way my entire body tensed like it already knew this was a mistake. Fine, I said, my voice flat, emotionless, like this conversation wasn't crawling under my skin, like it wasn't dragging up things I had buried years ago. I'll talk to him, but I'm not promising anything, and I'm not coming to the wedding just so you can parade me around like some heartwarming reunion story. If he wants to talk, he can call me himself. Daniel didn't respond right away, but I could hear the shift in his breathing, the way he was trying to figure out the right way to push me further, to get me to agree to more. But he must have realized I wasn't in the mood to be manipulated, because instead of arguing, he just exhaled sharply. I'll tell him, he said, his voice quieter now, less sure of itself. He might need a little time. I almost laughed at that, but it wasn't worth the energy. Time for what? I asked, my tone sharper than before. He said 7 years. What's a few more days? Daniel didn't have an answer to that, or maybe he just didn't want to say it out loud. Either way, he didn't try to defend Dad, didn't try to spin some excuse about why it had taken him this long to want to see me. Maybe he knew it wouldn't work. Or maybe, just maybe, he didn't have an answer either. I hung up before he could say anything else. I shouldn't have waited. I should have put my phone down and walked away. Let Daniel be the one to figure out how to fix this mess. Let him be the one to tell Dad that I wasn't interested in playing along with whatever script he had in mind. But instead, I just stood there, staring at the screen, watching the minutes tick by, waiting for a call I wasn't even sure was going to come. And when my phone finally rang, when my father's name appeared on the screen for the first time in years, my chest tightened so hard I almost couldn't breathe. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But I didn't. I pressed answer. The silence on the other end lasted longer than it should have, long enough that for a second, I thought maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he had nothing to say after all. But then, just as I was about to hang up, his voice finally came through the speaker, lower than I remembered, rougher, like it had been worn down over the years. Hello. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to. Another pause. heavier this time, like he was waiting for me to break the silence, to make this easier for him. But I wasn't going to do that. If he wanted this, if he really wanted to talk, he was going to have to be the one to start. I wasn't sure you'd pick up, he finally said, and I could tell he wasn't trying to sound guilty. But there was something there, something he couldn't quite hide. Neither was I admitted, my voice sharper than I intended, but I didn't bother softening it. I didn't know him that. Another pause, and then, Daniel said you wanted me to call. I let out a short, humorless breath. No, I corrected, leaning against the edge of my kitchen counter, pressing my free hand against the cool surface just to have something solid to hold on to. I said if you wanted to talk, you could call me yourself. There's a difference. There was another beat of silence, and then, you're right. I frowned, caught off guard by how easily he agreed. I had expected excuses. I had expected him to try and smooth this over, to act like everything that happened before didn't matter, like this was just another strained conversation between a father and son who had drifted apart over time. But he didn't do any of that. He just sat there, breathing through the phone, waiting for me to react. And I hated it. I hated that he wasn't making this easy to be angry. I hated that he wasn't feeding me the lines I had been expecting. I hated that I couldn't read him the way I used to, that I had no idea where this was going. So I pushed. What do you want? I asked, my voice cold, detached. Because if this is just some last-minute guilt trip, you can save yourself the trouble. His breath hitched just slightly, so small that if I hadn't been listening for it, I might have missed it. I don't expect anything from you, he said. And this time, his voice was quieter, rougher, like the words weren't coming easily. I didn't want to leave things like this. I clenched my jaw, staring down at the invitation still crumpled in my free hand. You already did. Another pause, and then, I know. I squeezed my eyes shut, suddenly exhausted, suddenly sick of this entire conversation, suddenly wishing I had let this call go to voicemail after all. I don't know what you want me to say, I admitted, my voice quieter now, more tired than I wanted it to be. Because I don't think there's anything you can say that's going to change anything. He was silent for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe that was it. Maybe he had finally run out of things to say. But then, just before I could hang up, he spoke again, softer this time, almost hesitant. I know you have no reason to believe me, he said slowly, carefully. But I am sorry. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly tight, my grip on the phone unsteady. I should have said something. I should have told him that sorry didn't fix anything, that sorry wasn't enough, that sorry didn't erase the years of silence. But for some reason, I couldn't make the words come out. So I just stood there, gripping my phone, listening to my father's uneven breathing on the other end of the line, knowing that for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't the one who had walked away. I told myself I wasn't going. I told myself there was nothing left to say, that this conversation had already lasted longer than it should have, that I didn't owe my father a damn thing. But somehow, despite every logical reason to stay away, I found myself standing in front of my childhood home, staring at the front door like it was some kind of trap waiting to spring shut the second I stepped inside. The house looked exactly the same dull beige siding, the same porch light that flickered even in daylight, the same wind chimes my mother had hung up years ago that always irritated me when I was trying to sleep. But standing here now, looking at this place that had once been mine, I felt like a stranger trespassing on someone else's memories. My hand tightened into a fist at my side as I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, ignoring the way my stomach twisted with something I refused to name. Before I could change my mind, I knocked. The sound was too loud, too final, like a decision I couldn't take back. It took a few seconds, long enough for me to consider turning around and walking away, but then the door opened, and there he was. My father looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders thinner, his face sharper, his skin sallow in a way that made it clear Daniel hadn't been lying. He really was dying. But even now, standing in front of me after all these years, after everything, he didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked like he had expected this, like he knew I would come, and something about that made my teeth clench. I hated that he was right. You came, he said, his voice rougher than it had been over the phone, weaker, but still carrying that same steady tone. The same control he had always held over every situation, as if he were the one allowing me to be here and not the other way around. I didn't bother acknowledging the obvious. You wanted to talk, I said flatly, shifting my weight, my arms crossing tightly over my chest, making it clear that I wasn't planning on staying longer than necessary. So talk. He hesitated, his eyes scanning my face, searching for something I wasn't willing to give. Then he stepped back, motioning for me to come inside. I didn't move. I had spent too many years convincing myself that this house was no longer mine, that there was nothing for me here. But standing out on the porch, standing outside while he stood inside, I could already feel the power shift, the way he was trying to control this moment, to put himself in charge of how this conversation played out. I wasn't giving him that. If you have something to say it here. I told him, my voice steady, not giving an inch. A long silence stretched between us, the kind that would have made me uncomfortable years ago, back when I still cared about what he thought of me, back when I would have done anything to make him proud. But now, it didn't touch me. Then, finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand down his face before stepping back and leaving the door open. Suit yourself. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside, but the second I did, I regretted it. The air was thick, stale, carrying the weight of a house that had been lived in for too long without enough people to fill it. The furniture was the same, the pictures on the walls unchanged, frozen in time like the last 7 years hadn't happened. My mother's presence was still here, woven into every piece of decor, every framed photo, every stupid little ceramic figurine she used to collect. And yet, she was gone. Not physically. She had left years before I did. Another casualty of my father's inability to love anyone who didn't fit into the box he had created for them. But in a way that mattered, in a way that meant this house had been his ever since, and that alone made me want to turn around and leave. He motioned toward the living room, but I didn't move, didn't sit, didn't make myself comfortable. I wasn't staying long enough for that. He sat down slowly, wincing slightly as he settled into the chair he had always claimed as his, the one no one else had dared sit in when we were kids. I watched him, waiting, and when he finally met my gaze again, there was something in his eyes I didn't recognize. Not regret, not guilt, but something close. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said, his voice lower now, heavier, like the weight of the words was pressing down on him. I don't even expect you to believe me when I say I know I was wrong. But I do want you to understand something. I didn't react, didn't let him see how those words chipped at something inside me. I had spent too many years waiting for him to admit he was wrong, for him to acknowledge what he had done, and now that he was finally saying it, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like too little, too late. I made a mistake, he continued, his gaze steady on mine, no longer wavering, no longer hesitant. I let my pride get in the way. I let my anger make decisions for me. And by the time I realized what I had done, I didn't know how to fix it. I scoffed, shaking my head. That's bullshit. My voice was sharp, cutting, my patience already running thin. You didn't just let your pride get in the way. You made a choice. You looked at me, your own son, and decided I wasn't worth keeping in your life. That wasn't some mistake you didn't understand. That was deliberate. He didn't argue. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, but I saw the way his hands curled into fists, the way his shoulders tensed like he wanted to fight back, like he wanted to tell me I was wrong. But he didn't. He just sat there, breathing heavier now, as if just having this conversation was exhausting him. Maybe it was. Maybe that was why he was doing this now, at the very end, when he had nothing left to hold over me, no way to force me to listen except with whatever little time he had left. I don't expect you to understand, he finally said, his voice softer now, like the fight had drained out of him. But I need you to know that I do regret it. Not because I'm dying, not because I'm scared, but because I lost my son long before any of that. Something in my chest tightened painfully, and I hated it. Hated that he still had the power to make me feel anything at all. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter. I wanted to tell him that regret didn't erase anything, that words weren't enough, that there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been done. But I couldn't. Because for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He wasn't making excuses. He was just telling the truth. And I had no idea what to do with that. I didn't sit down. I wasn't going to make myself comfortable in a house that stopped being mine the day he told me to leave. And I wasn't going to act like this was some emotional reunion where a few words could make up for years of silence. I stood with my arms crossed, watching him like I was waiting for him to say something that would justify all of this. something that would make me regret staying away, something that would explain why, after all this time, he suddenly needed me here. He looked like he had aged twice as fast since the last time I had seen him, thinner than before, his skin pale and stretched too tight over sharp bones. His breathing was slow, controlled, but every once in a while, I could see his chest rise just a little too hard, like even talking was taking something out of him. But none of that mattered. I wasn't here to feel sorry for him. I was here because I needed to know what he wasn't saying. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest like he was trying to figure out where to start, like there was a right way to have this conversation. There wasn't. "I know you don't want to be here," he finally said, his voice lower than before, almost careful, like he thought I might walk out if he said the wrong thing. "And I don't blame you for that." "Good," I said, because I needed him to know that I wasn't playing along with whatever guilt trip he had in mind. "Then get to the point." His fingers stopped tapping, curling slightly into the armrest before relaxing again. "I want to explain," he said, and I could hear something in his voice, something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't far from it. "About what happened. About why you threw me out." I cut in, my jaw tight, my hands clenched at my sides. "Why you decided I wasn't worth being part of this family anymore." His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his throat bobbed slightly, the way his gaze flickered just for a second before settling back on me. "Yes." I waited, letting the silence hang between us, daring him to actually say something real for once. He exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing again before he looked me in the eye and said the one thing I wasn't expecting. "I lied to you." Everything inside me went still, my body frozen in place, my breath locked somewhere in my throat. The words didn't make sense at first, didn't fit with anything I had prepared myself to hear. My fingers twitched at my sides, my stomach twisting, but I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "About what?" His gaze didn't waver, and that was the worst part. He wasn't avoiding the question. He wasn't trying to backtrack or soften the blow. He just answered, "About why I told you to leave." The air in the room felt different, heavier, like something was shifting beneath the surface, something that had been buried for too long. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, steady and loud, drowning out everything else as I forced myself to ask the only question that mattered. "Then why?" He didn't look away, but I could see the hesitation in his expression, the weight pressing down on him as if saying it out loud would make it real, as if keeping it to himself had been the only thing keeping him in control. His hands tightened against the armrest again before he finally spoke. "Because I had to." My teeth clenched, my nails digging into my palms. "That's not an answer." His jaw shifted, the tension in his shoulders visible now, his breathing slower, heavier, but he didn't break eye contact. "It's the only one I can give you right now." A sharp, frustrated breath escaped me, my chest tightening with the kind of anger that had nowhere to go. "You don't get to say that," I snapped, stepping closer, my hands uncrossing, my body tense. "You don't get to call me here, tell me you lied, and then act like you don't owe me the truth." His expression hardened just slightly, like some part of him still wanted to fight back, still wanted to keep control, but his next words weren't what I was expecting. "There are things you don't know," he said, quieter now, his voice lower, but there was something behind it, something that made my skin prickle. "Things I didn't tell you because I thought it would protect you. Things that I thought would make it easier for you if you just hated me instead." I stared at him, my entire body rigid, my breath coming sharper now. "What things?" His fingers curled tighter against the armrest, his throat working like he was trying to swallow down whatever it was he wanted to say. "Things about Daniel," he said, and for the first time, his voice wasn't controlled. It was careful, calculated, like he was measuring every word before he said it. Something cold crept down my spine, something instinctive, something that told me this conversation was about to go somewhere I hadn't been prepared for. "What about Daniel?" He hesitated again, just for a second, and that was all it took for me to know that whatever was about to come out of his mouth, I wasn't going to like it. Then, finally, he spoke. "He's the reason I had to make you leave." The words landed like a punch to the chest, knocking the air out of me for just a second before the confusion settled in, thick and unwelcome, clouding everything else. "What the hell are you talking about?" My voice was sharper now, my heart pounding, my mind racing to keep up with the shift in the conversation. His expression didn't change, but I saw something else in his eyes now, something I didn't recognize. Daniel came to me. He said slowly, deliberately, like he needed me to hear every word. And he gave me a choice. Every muscle in my body locked in place, my hands twitching at my sides, my breathing shallow. A choice about what? His next words came out quieter than before, but they landed heavier than anything else he had said. Either I let you go, or I lost everything. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for him to explain, waiting for him to fix whatever the hell he had just broken. But he didn't. He just sat there, breathing heavier now, his fingers white-knuckled against the armrest, waiting for me to catch up to a truth I hadn't even known I was missing. I stood there, gripping the back of the chair in front of me, feeling the tension in my arms, my jaw, my chest, as my father's words settled into something real. None of it made sense, but the way he sat there, waiting, refusing to look away, refusing to take it back, told me he wasn't lying. My mind raced through the past, through every fight, every silence, every time I had wondered why things had happened the way they did, and now here it was, the answer sitting right in front of me, waiting for me to do something with it. I forced my breath to slow, forced my hands to relax just enough to keep myself from snapping, but my voice still came out sharp when I spoke. "You're telling me that Daniel gave you an ultimatum," I said, my words slow, deliberate, making sure I had heard him right. "That it was either me or everything else. That's what you're saying." My father nodded, his hands tightening against the armrests again, his posture sinking slightly, as if the weight of this conversation was finally catching up to him. "Yes." I let out a short breath, shaking my head, my fingers pressing into the chair. "And what the hell does that even mean? What would you have lost? Money? Your reputation? What was so important that you were willing to throw me out over it?" There was a pause, one that stretched too long, one that made my stomach turn before he even opened his mouth. "Daniel took control of everything," he said finally, his voice quieter now, rougher. "The business, the accounts, the house, all of it. He put everything under his name. I didn't see it coming. I didn't think he would. I felt the shift in my body before I even registered it, my hands clenching again, my muscles locking in place, my breath coming out faster now. Are you seriously telling me that Daniel blackmailed you?" My father exhaled slowly, shaking his head, but not in denial, more in frustration, in regret. "It wasn't that simple." "The hell it wasn't," I snapped, the anger coming too fast now, too sharp. "You're telling me he walked in here, told you to get rid of me, and you just did it? Without asking why? Without pushing back?" He looked away for the first time, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling against the chair. I didn't think I had a choice. I laughed, but there was nothing funny about any of this. "That's bullshit. There's always a choice." He didn't argue. He just let the silence sit between us, let it fill every crack in the conversation until the weight of it was pressing down so hard I could barely stand still. My chest tightened, my mind racing through everything I thought I had known, every memory I had of my brother, every interaction, every small, unnoticed moment that now felt like it meant something more. I had spent years believing my father had abandoned me because he wanted to, because I wasn't good enough, because I had somehow deserved it. But it had never been about me. It had been about Daniel. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to pull back just enough to focus, to think, to push past the anger long enough to figure out what came next. Why? My voice was quieter now, but no less sharp. Why would he do that? My father swallowed, his eyes heavier now, something unreadable in them, something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. "Because you were a problem." A cold, sick feeling curled in my stomach. What does that mean? His hands tightened on the chair again, his knuckles going white. It means he had plans. It means he didn't want anyone standing in the way of them. And it means he knew that if you stayed, you would stand in the way. I stared at him, my breath slow, steady, but my mind was moving too fast, trying to piece together a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. "What plans?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face, his frustration breaking through now, not at me, but at himself, at the situation, at whatever past mistake had led to this moment. "He used me," he admitted, his voice flat now, almost empty. "He used my name, my connections, my business to set himself up. And once he had what he needed, once he had full control, he made sure there was no one left who could take it away from him." I shook my head, my grip on the chair tightening again. And you let him. His shoulders slumped slightly, but he didn't deny it. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, to push back the fire burning in my chest. What do you want from me? His gaze lifted again, and for the first time, there was something almost desperate in it. I don't want anything from you, he said, and for once, I believed him. I just wanted you to know the truth. I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind still reeling from everything he had just told me, everything that had just changed. But then, before I could even begin to process what to do next, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my fingers stiff, my breath still uneven as I looked down at the screen. Daniel. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, the weight of the past pressing in from all sides. I could feel my father watching me, waiting, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. This was my decision now. I exhaled slowly, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then, I pressed decline. I turned back to my father, shoving my phone into my pocket, my chest tightening as I spoke the only words that mattered now. I'm not going to his wedding. Something in my father's expression shifted, something almost relieved, almost resigned. I didn't think you would. I nodded once, then turned, moving toward the door, my footsteps heavy against the floor, my mind already sorting through everything that had changed, everything I still didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. I wasn't coming back. Not to this house. Not to this family. Not to whatever Daniel had built with the pieces he had stolen. And for the first time in 7 years, I knew I wasn't the one who had lost anything.